Hi, my name is Christina Baker-Klein. I'm the author of the novel Orphan Train, and I've come up with a list of the top 10 questions that book clubs ask because I can't go to every book club, but I know that a lot of people are interested in the answers to these particular questions, so here we go. I hope you'll enjoy them. Orphan Train is a novel that took a lot of research, and I spent years meeting people. I traveled to Ireland, I traveled to the Midwest. I did lots of research in New York at the Tenement Museum and New York Historical Society, Library of Congress, New York Public Library. It was really important to me to get the facts right in this book. Everything that happened in the book actually happened to someone. But I was careful also not to use the most extreme stories that I found because I wanted it to sort of be representative at the same time that I didn't want to lose the individuality of my character. So it was important to me to kind of have a story that resonated for people who'd really been through it and who were descendants of people who'd been through it, but at the same time I wanted to tell a story that also felt unique and felt very individual and specific to my character. A question I get a lot is about whether the Grotes home was really something that could have happened, because it was sort of a dire circumstance where my character, as you know, goes into a home that has no running water, and it's in the middle of the woods, and it's cold, and the parents are neglectful. Sadly, yes, there were many stories like the one of Vivian going into the Grotes home, Dorothy at the time. And in fact, I came across an article that I use in my slideshow, which is about immigrants on the plains of North Dakota taking train riders into sod huts and mistreating them terribly. And it was in the Washington Post. It was around 1915. And they were trying to pass legislation so that this wouldn't happen, but in fact there was no such legislation. There were stories of bad circumstances. At the same time, as you know from reading the book and seeing the other kinds of situations I show, I think the experiences the children had were as varied as human nature, and some children had very happy experiences. One of the most interesting things I found as I was researching the book is how many train riders had kept their stories secret until somehow it came out. A descendant asked a question. You know, many of them didn't have birth certificates, so that was strange. Eventually, when children or grandchildren started sort of snooping around and saying, "But I don't understand," or "You don't look anything like the people you grew up with," or "How did this happen?" Train riders kept their stories secret for a lot of reasons, one of which is that some of them were too young to really know what had happened to them. There was a stigma around adoption in general at the time of the train riders, and there was even more of a stigma about having been, as one of them said, put on a barge, you know, as if out to sea, garbage on a barge, and sent to the Midwest like refuse. And so they felt often embarrassed about what had happened to them. And so it wasn't until the 60s, 70s, even 80s and 90s that many train riders told their stories. And, you know, there are still some out there who have never talked. I think the question of how the train riders feel about having been put on the train is a really complicated one, because they started out, and as one train rider said to me, every child who was on a train had been through some tremendous trauma or they wouldn't be there. So they started out sort of damaged, and also they were told to keep quiet about what had happened to them. So they weren't allowed to share anything really about what they had been through. So they pushed it down, and I think that that was a lot to live with. On the other hand, later in life, many train riders expressed that they felt that they'd been given a second chance at life, because if they'd stayed in New York, more than likely they would have ended up in terrible circumstances, in jail, on the streets, even in prostitution. Disease was rampant among the children who lived on the streets of New York. There were no protective services at all. There was no child welfare system at all, no welfare, no child foster care or any kind of, there were no work laws. poor children were labor. So you were kind of stuck. There was no social mobility in New York at the time. So getting a second chance and coming to the Midwest, even if there was a rocky transition, often meant that these children could grow up and have sort of normal lives once they got over the trauma of having been sent. And many of them say that they were happy about what had happened eventually. They had children, they had grandchildren. There's what I call a narrative of redemption that I heard over and over again, reading the train riders' stories and talking to a number of them, which was, I started out with this terrible situation. I went on a train, I had a rocky transition, and then eventually I found my footing, and now I'm so grateful that I have this wonderful life and these wonderful children. So I do think ultimately many of them felt they were better off. A lot of people ask whether the research for this book gave me a bleak perspective of human nature because my character goes through so many difficult situations and ends up with a kind of happiness. Perhaps it is a happiness, but it's not the love of two parents. And so there is this pervasive feeling of loss on some level. But actually, I heard so many varied stories that it doesn't at all give me a bleak perspective of human nature. The truth is, children went into homes, sometimes that were wonderful and others that were challenging. A friend of mine told me this wonderful story recently. Her son was a freshman at Tufts, and he was hit by a car. It was actually in a semi-conscious coma. He was in a terrible condition. His two best friends from Tufts, and by the way, this was his freshman year. It was actually fall of his freshman year. But two kids at Tufts dropped out temporarily. They took the spring semester off to get an apartment together, a boy and a girl who were just friends, to be with him. He improved rapidly because they'd been by his side, but his mother, who lives in Philadelphia and had to commute back and forth to Boston, was overwhelmed, and she said to the girl at one point, "Why would you put your life on hold to do this, to be with this person?" And the girl said, "This is my life. This is my life, and I'm choosing to do this with it." And to me, that illustrates something about human nature that is really deep, that some people have that response to adversity and others have a different one. But we all, I think, when I heard all the many stories about the Midwest and tried to show them in the book, I had a much broader sense, I think, of what people were capable of. And that gave me hope. A lot of people ask me why I wrote a novel and not nonfiction about the orphan trains. There have actually been a number of books that are nonfiction that are really good about the trains. There are also a few other good novels that I've got in a list of hyperlinks on my website, so you can easily find those. But I personally, first of all, I'm a novelist. I really like writing fiction. And second, I felt that I could get at the heart of the story more easily as a novelist. I wanted to show what it really felt like to be a child on a train. And I think in a history, sometimes you feel that you need to give a lot more information. Furthermore, I think the train riders themselves, I could have focused on one person, but I think that the train riders themselves often want to emphasize the happy endings, and rightfully so. Many of them have ended up having quite full and wonderful lives. But I wanted to show what it felt like. I wanted to dwell in the moments that weren't quite as happy, and I felt that as a novelist I was able to do that, and I had more leeway, and I also had sort of my own permission to explore those more complicated areas. When you start writing a novel, you don't always know what's going to happen. I had a rough idea at the beginning. Actually, I had more than a rough idea. I knew that I wanted a strong 91-year-old woman who would remind me of some of the people that I spoke with, some of the living train riders that I interviewed for the book. And I also knew that I wanted a 17-year-old girl who would provide a counterpoint, who would be a girl who'd gone through a lot in foster care and who had trouble opening up, but with this old woman would develop a relationship. So that was all clear from the beginning. One of the things, though, that I thought would be a pivotal plot point is that eventually Molly, in desperation, would steal Vivian's necklace. Because then it would set into motion Dina throwing her out of the house. Dina would rightfully accuse her of having stolen the necklace. We'd already set it up because she'd stolen a book. And my thought was that she would steal the necklace because she was sort of terrified of ending the relationship. Her hours were almost over, and then she would be thrust back into this foster care situation, and it would be a sort of traumatic thing. But when I got closer and closer to Molly stealing the necklace, I knew it didn't make any sense. She had become such good friends with Vivian, I knew she wouldn't do it. And so it made more sense, and actually it was more sort of thematically resonant for her to be accused of stealing a book that she didn't steal, that Vivian had given to her. So that's one example of something that I changed when I got closer and closer. As you're writing a novel, you understand your characters more and more as you go, and sometimes your characters kind of teach you the way forward, and that was what happened. I hated that Maisie had to die in my novel, and I had originally planned that she wouldn't die. I didn't want her to die. I had this vision as I was writing that these two old women would get on a plane together and go to Ireland and go back to the village that they'd come from. That was my original plan. But as I was researching the book, it seemed to defy probability, that there would be a healthy 83-year-old woman and a healthy 91-year-old woman, and they would get together and everything would be fine. And also, as I got closer and closer to that moment, I realized that even though it was sad that Maisie might have died, it cleared the way for Vivian to have a reunion with her own daughter, which suddenly occurred to me later as I was writing the book and not at the very beginning. And I loved the way that that story unfolded. So I was really happy to be able to make that happen. When I wrote the last scene of Orphan Train, I was living in London for the summer, and I had this weekend that I had set aside completely, Friday through Sunday, and I thought, I'm just not going to leave my apartment. I'm going to stay here until the scene is done. And I didn't quite know how it would unfold. And I had a vision in my head of a young woman walking up a path, of Vivian's daughter walking up a path, but I didn't know if she would end up in the house or if I would write more. And as I wrote the scene, I realized that the fact that Vivian was standing on the porch and her daughter, who was a little bit ambivalent and wasn't sure yet how she felt, was by the car, but that this granddaughter came running up, felt like the perfect end for me. It felt like there were multiple generations. There was hope in it. I felt it was clear that the daughter and Vivian were going to need a little bit of time to understand how their relationship would unfold. And I also felt that it was really clear that this daughter and Vivian, in other words, the granddaughter and Vivian, would have a reunion that was unfiltered, that was clear and clean and immediately connecting. And that felt like a perfect way to end. A lot of people ask me why Vivian gave away her baby, and I totally understand that people want to know that. I do think, as I talk to lots of book clubs, that eventually people can talk their way into it. And as I think about the book itself, the book might have benefited by having a conversation between Molly and Vivian that explored this in a little bit more depth. But I'll give you some reasons why Vivian gave away her baby, May. Vivian was alone. She was in mourning. She was terrified. Her husband had just died, the only man she'd ever loved. Mrs. Nielsen was warm in some ways. She was a sort of parental figure, but she didn't want to be called mother or mom. And Vivian never had a relationship with her as a mother-daughter. So she felt very alone. She also was afraid that she didn't have the tools to take care of a baby. The way children of alcoholics fear becoming alcoholic, and the way children of abuse are afraid of becoming perpetrators, Vivian and many train writers have mentioned to me that they didn't have children because they were just afraid that they didn't know how to do it, or that they wouldn't do it right, or that they'd been abused themselves and so didn't feel that they knew how to handle that. And also, as Vivian articulates in the book, she had lost at that point everything she had really ever loved. She'd lost her parents, she lost her siblings, her sister Maisie, of course, and then most recently her husband, Dutchie. And she was afraid that if she fell in love again with this baby, that she was risking losing that. And it felt like too great a loss to bear. So those are the reasons why.